Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, the Prime Minister has ruled out an election on the same day as the upcoming local council votes. That would be May the 2nd. But when it does happen, could we still have two votes on general election day? An influential group of Conservative MPs wants the government to also hold a referendum on whether the UK should leave the European Convention on Human Rights, or the ECHR. And the man they'd want to lead that campaign?
A beautiful day.
Yep, Boris Johnson. It's all to try and stop European courts getting a say in what we do in the UK, and ultimately to try and hold on to voters who might be thinking of switching to Reform UK in the general election. Let's start with that statement from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Because speculation has been rife in Westminster that there could have been an election called on the 2nd of May to coincide with votes for local councillors and mayors in England, but he's now specifically ruled that out, with Labour saying he's running scared. They want an election called sooner rather than later, but it's now very unlikely to be before the autumn. When we do get a date, what about this suggestion of an ECHR referendum at the same time? Let's find out what it's all about with our correspondent, Alex Barker.
What is the European Convention on Human Rights? Well, it's a treaty which sets out a list of protected rights like the prohibition of slavery and the right to privacy. It was signed by countries including the UK in 1950, and it's separate to the European Union, which is why the UK is still a member even after Brexit. The European Court of Human Rights is tasked with making sure everyone sticks to the convention, and last year it weighed in to stop the UK's first flight carrying asylum seekers to Rwanda. Since then, that scheme has been bogged down by legal challenges here in the UK too, and the government's now trying to get an emergency law passed to actually get things going and planes taking off. It's also emerged the government is looking at extending a different scheme to offer people who've had their asylum claims rejected in the UK up to £3,000 to voluntarily move to Rwanda. That's prompted more MPs to call for the UK to leave the ECHR.
I understand the latest scheme that's been considered is to pay migrants thousands of pounds to leave Britain. Prime Minister, let's just leave the ECHR and deport them for free. So far, over 40,000 Brits have signed my petition with a Conservative post calling for us to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
A whole group of Tory MPs, called New Conservatives, says this is one of the major issues which is pushing voters over to Reform UK, a party seen as taking a tougher stance on immigration. So the New Conservatives are leading calls for Rishi Sunak to hold a referendum on whether the UK should leave the ECHR at the same time as the general election, in the hope that will help the government stick to their Rwanda policy and keep some more Tory supporters with the party. And they say this is the man for the job. They want Boris Johnson back on the campaign trail to lead the ECHR Leave camp, despite him not even being an MP anymore. They say he's got the biggest appeal, especially when it comes to those red wall seats in the Midlands and the north of England, which turned blue for the first time in the last election. So it's being called Super Thursday, 2 votes on one day. But just how much support does this idea have?
Well, let's try and get an idea. I'm joined by the MP for Crawley, Henry Smith, who supports leaving the ECHR and Reform. Also with us is former Cabinet Minister Sir Robert Buckland. Now, you're both Conservatives, you're both supposed to be on the same side, but there is disagreement on this particular issue. So, Henry, perhaps I could start with you. Let's deal first of all with the prospect of whether a referendum on the same day of the general election is really actually a starter. Is that going to happen?
Well, I haven't personally called for a referendum on the ECHR on the same day as a general election, but of course it's perfectly possible, and there is some sense to the fact of holding elections on the same day for the reasons of turnout and just the administration of that. Do I think we're going to get a referendum on the same day as the general election? No, I don't. But I do think it's very important that we are talking about reforming the ECHR, because I think it is a system that was designed for post-Second World War Europe and the human rights regime at that time. And I don't think it is really fit for purpose in terms of addressing the significant, particularly mass migration issues that the UK and frankly the rest of Europe and many other parts of the world, for that matter, are facing at the moment.
So Robert, nevertheless, whilst there almost certainly won't be a referendum on the same day as the general election, the question of UK membership of the ECHR continues to be a point of contention with both the public and politicians. Now, David Cameron even pledged in the 2010 Manifesto to come out of it and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. So can I ask you, if it was good enough for you to win your first election in 2010 on that manifesto, what's changed for you to now hold a different opinion?
Well, no, I mean, actually, we talked about a British Bill of Rights. I don't think we talked about wholesale withdrawal from the convention. The point about a British Bill of Rights was to, if you like, fill in the gaps that this country, with an unwritten constitution, might be perceived to have, as opposed to, say, Germany, with its written constitution, or indeed the Republic of Ireland. I think that the British Bill of Rights sort of met a rather undignified end with a commission that couldn't agree on anything. There was then an attempt to revive it under my successor, Dominic Raab, which similarly, I think, deservedly met an ill-fated end. The truth is that I really don't think that people on the Clapham Omnibus are worrying about whether or not Britain is a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. It's not anywhere near a priority issue for this country. And frankly, I'm amazed that we are having a debate about something like this. The convention, which is totally separate from the EU, nothing to do with that, has been something that we helped to create as British Conservatives, that we actually lead Europe on in terms of not having a problem or an issue with compliance with it. And that when people talk about mass migration, and I think Henry absolutely raises a legitimate point here, we're actually talking about another convention altogether, the 1951 Convention on Refugees, the Geneva Convention, which doesn't really take into account the fact that refugees pass through many other safe countries before coming, for example, to the UK or indeed to other Western parts of Western Europe. Now, I'm up for a proper discussion as to updating that. I'm up for a discussion as to how we make the mechanism within which we comply with the European Convention better. But what I think is a complete red herring is the question of withdrawal. It would be an absolute, an abandonment of British leadership internationally.
Perhaps I can pick you up.
Obviously, countenance this.
But perhaps I could just pick you up on that point with this sort of simple contention, and feel free to put me right. So, Robert, you would know more than anyone else, having been a former Justice Secretary. Aren't states capable of protecting human rights without participating in an international convention?
Well, look, of course they are. But the advantage of having helped write, in fact, drafted the convention and being part of it means that we can help police it and reform it. We're talking here about fundamental human rights, the right to life, right not to be tortured, sort of sensible things that we all actually now share in Western Europe, which of course were not the case in the aftermath of the Second World War. But, you know, there are people out there, mainly on the left of politics, who want to extend this rights culture into rights to benefit, rights to work, rights to housing, which I think is just wrong. And I think the real battleground here is between those of us like Henry and me and other Conservatives who would oppose the creation of socioeconomic rights, because that really risks bringing the courts into realms of politics and policy that I'm pretty sure they don't want to dwell in. And that's what we've got to defend. There's of course, a tension, Nick, between rights-based law and our English and Welsh and Scottish system of law here, which has evolved over the centuries. But just because there's a tension doesn't mean that, therefore, we have to press the nuclear button. Let
me take that point up with you, if I may, Henry Smith. With the furor that dominates the media and the news over Rwanda and the intervention of the ECHR, doesn't that actually, as Sir Robert's pointing out, allow us to overlook the force for good that the ECHR has been. I mean, would you agree it's profoundly influenced the protection of rights in the UK for homosexuals in the army, for example, for the protection of journalistic sources, and I think even the internment of people, internees in Northern Ireland. So how does coming out of the ECHR, how would you reassure British citizens that those rights and protections wouldn't be lost?
Well, first of all, I think that very few people would disagree that those fundamental rights, right to life, protection from torture, right to a family life, all of the many aspects of the human rights architecture, very few people, perhaps with the exception of Mr. Putin and a few of his friends, would disagree that those are fundamental rights that need to be defended. But you mentioned earlier on that other countries have very strong human rights regimes, the United States, for example, which aren't members of the European Convention on Human Rights, obviously, and also the fact that, of course, we have been developing our human rights architecture, you could argue, from the time of Magna Carta in 1215, and that indeed we have a very strong history of human rights in this country that long predates the ECHR and indeed the Human Rights Act of the late 1990s. So the sort of idea that if we weren't part of the ECHR, suddenly human rights would come to a grinding halt in this country, I think just doesn't bear historical truth to it. But I'm more interested in reform. One of the concerns I have, and Robert's right, in terms of migration, the Refugee Convention is also prescient when it comes to that. I'm interested in a human rights system that is relevant for, we're now a quarter of the way through the 21st century, that's relevant to the times we face now, and perhaps does need to be updated from the late 1940s, 1950s, when the European Convention on Human Rights was being formed, and Robert's absolutely accurate. We were one of the key drafters of that. I think now Britain has a responsibility to be leading that reform so that we have human rights architecture
so let me press you
that
on,
is robust for the future.
Let me press you on reform, because actually reform may be different coming out of the ECHR. Do you think that actually to reform, the method of a Bill of Rights would be more attractive and understood more, despite the misgivings of Sir Robert Buckland as a former Justice Secretary? Do you think that's the way forward?
Well, I'm very sorry that Bill of Rights, which, as you correctly say, was first suggested by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, and then was last sought to be pursued by Dominic Raab when he was Justice Secretary. I'm very sorry that wasn't successful. I think that certainly with what was once an 80-seat Conservative majority, and I guess we're coming onto this subject in a little bit, we could have been quite bold in terms of the ability to update our human rights and refugee legislation, and indeed many other areas as well that we didn't. But I appreciate we've had COVID in between, but I do think there are missed opportunities in the Bill of Rights.
There may be missed opportunities, but there could be considerable pitfalls. So Robert, again, looking back as Justice Secretary, we have now, pretty much, I think, thanks to the Human Rights Act, but we have now ECHR effectively embedded in just about every aspect of laws that have come out of Parliament, not least, of course, in international treaties as well, with the Good Friday Agreement and even the trade agreement with the EU. How do you successfully extricate yourself from those agreements?
Well, this is the point. We don't want to. That's the point.
But if we were forced to, could we?
But no, because look, we're going to endanger the Union of the United Kingdom if we go down this road. And I'm sorry to be dramatic, but that's how I see it from my viewpoint as chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. The Good Friday Agreement has an underpinning of the European Convention in it with good reason, because there was an entire community in Northern Ireland. It's not a community that I would identify with. I'm a unionist, but it's the nationalist Republican community who, for reasons that we all know well, did not have faith in the UK's trial and justice system because of their experiences during the Troubles. And therefore the ECHR underpins that agreement in a way that I think too few of colleagues really understand. So if we start meddling with this and not just toying with, but actively advocating withdrawal from the convention, we really start to undermine and unravel our United Kingdom. And I think that would be a disaster. I think that the Bill of Rights concept was a real Trojan horse, frankly. It wasn't just a sensible attempt to codify the law. It risked creating a whole new range of domestic rights-based legislation that could have opened a real door to the sort of rights-based laws that I think we'd all agree as Conservatives would be really worrying. I thought it was ill thought out, ill judged and ill timed. What we should have done was pursue what the Manifesto of 2019 said, which I helped to draft, which was an updating of the Human Rights Act to clear up some of the issues that we've had to grapple with, to make it very clear that there shouldn't be a slavish adherence to the case law of Europe, or indeed even necessarily a presumption that everything should be construed in a way compatible with the convention, and that there would be more discretion allowed to the courts and indeed to decision makers to work within what we call the margin of appreciation. Those reforms were nearly ready to go and they were ignored by my successor, and we lost valuable time.
Do you think, Henry, and I'll give Robert the opportunity to answer the same question, do you think that the ECHR should be in the next manifesto, and do you think the Conservatives can agree common ground around that manifesto?
I do think we do need to be having ECHR reform as part of the manifesto. Robert's right, it's not something that people on the Clapham Omnibus are talking about, but the consequences of how it restricts policies that they do want to see, and the sort of pajama judgment to stop the Rwanda flights is an example of that, does matter. So people might not be caught up on the structure, but the consequences of it is something that I think should be in the manifesto.
That is a key point, isn't it, Sir Robert? That we could argue the complexities here, but the Clapham Omnibus, whilst it might not be talking about the ECHR, certainly former Conservative voters who are looking at reform are looking at the consequences of it. So can you agree common ground, do you think, in the run-up to the election in the manifesto for Conservatives?
Well, given that the court themselves have now come up with proposals to reform the pyjama system by actually identifying the judges and allowing a proper challenge to the decisions, I really think that the issue is diminishing in terms of its importance. Look, my advice is to leave this best well alone. I think we should renew our pledge to update and reform the Human Rights Act. We've got proposals that are ready to go. We can do that, and frankly, we should have done that by now, and that we adopt very much a more practical approach than offering yet another referendum on an issue that most people really either haven't had the time to consider or don't really care about. Let's focus on the economy. Let's focus on the issues that actually matter to people, and that will be the way to win an election. Not chasing some elusive side issue that really is of very little importance at all.
Nevertheless, Henry, there are 10% of voting intention at the moment, if the polls are to be believed, are going to reform. You've just lost one MP who has gone to reform. They're going to be trying to keep this very much in the news and talking about inability to control the borders and blaming part of the problem not just at the feet of the government, but at the feet of the ECHR. How much of an issue should this be in the election? Even if it's not one you want to fight it on, aren't you going to have to address the threat from reform?
Well, I think Robert is right, actually. I think the bread and butter issues that people ultimately will care about is the economy, getting inflation down, getting the economy growing again, hopefully getting taxation down further so that we have a larger economy so we can afford the public services that people want to see. Those, I think, are the core issues. And I think any party that strays too far from those will find themselves in trouble. But nevertheless, if you look at my email inbox from constituents, they are very concerned at what they see as our inability to be able to essentially control our own borders. They're not anti-immigration, but they're pro-lawful immigration. Immigration that is of a benefit to this country, not an immigration system that seemingly allows criminal gangs to behave with impunity. That's what they're concerned about. That's what they feel very unfair and aggrieved about. A lot of taxpayers' money being spent accommodating people who have basically circumvented the system via criminal gangs. And I think unless we are also addressing those issues in addition to those bread and butter issues of the economy, then I fear that reform will take votes from the Conservative. And of course, a split vote from the right of centre will let Keir Starmer into Downing Street. And I think the consequences of a Labour government will be deeply damaging, not only for issues such as immigration for this country, but more importantly, the economy as well.
Do you also think, Sir Robert, that what's damaging to the country is that we seem to be dominated now by endless debate over when the next election is going to be? Your own Prime Minister has just ruled out May now, or certainly May the 2nd as the election date. We are at what some people rather cruelly say is the fag end of the Parliament, that nothing seems to be getting done. Everything is seen through the lens of the election. Let me put it to both of you. You came into Parliament in 2010, which is the only time we've had a fixed term Parliament where the debate of the election, the date of the election, was not up for a debate. Is there part of you now that thinks we should return to that so we can focus on governing and not debating about the election?
No, really, no. I well remember the pain of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in that Parliament of 2017, where in the end we had to legislate to actually allow the election of 2019 to happen, which the public desperately needed, the country desperately needed in order to get through that broken Parliament. No, I think it's entirely right we removed that piece of legislation. Look, the speculation has been brought about by a very hyperactive opposition that has nothing else to talk about because it has no policies and wants to stir up the prospect of an election date. Rishi Sunak said that his working assumption was no election in the first half of the year, so nobody should be surprised at all that the election is likely to be later in the year. We've still got months to go. Henry and I are both active parliamentarians looking at and scrutinising legislation that's in the pipeline at the moment on vital issues like the digital economy. We'll have a bill on football regulation. We've got ongoing budgetary measures like national insurance cuts to get through. Plenty for us to be getting on with. And look, I do strongly agree with Henry about the need for us to address the concerns of our constituents on issues of unlawful and illegal immigration. And, my view is, reform will do what they're going to do. I'm not interested in the personalities of reform, but I am interested in the views of voters who tell me that they are considering voting for another party like Reform. We've got to focus on what matters to them. They choose what the issues are in the election, and Conservatives have always been best advised not merely to follow the voters, but to understand their priorities and to lead in a way that is honest, that is straightforward, and that provides answers to the problems that they face.
Henry Smith, you're one of 61 MPs now, I think, on the Conservative side who've said that they are retiring from Parliament. You said it some time ago, to be fair. I've described it as a bit of a fag end of a Parliament. Are you all now out looking for jobs or assiduously working? I say that tongue in cheek, but it does feel like that to the public, that actually you've all moved on, but the country hasn't got the chance to have its view. Fixed-term parliaments do have an advantage, don't they?
Not in the British system. I think the fixed-term parliament was, I entirely endorse everything that Robert has just said. The fixed-term parliament was a fix to ensure that the coalition was able to see its 5 years through. It's against the British tradition. Our parliaments are up to 5 years. With the Prime Minister being able to go to the monarch to dissolve Parliament up to that point. Rishi Sunak also very clearly said, I think almost a year ago, that it would be the second half of 2024 when the general election should be.
He did indeed, and I'm on that note of harmony and agreement. I'm going to say thank you very much to you both, Henry Smith, MP for Crawley, soon to be retiring MP for Crawley, and Sir Robert Buckland, former Justice Minister, member of the Cabinet. Thanks again, of course, to my guests, and don't forget to go to TRT World's YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.